Welcome to Avoidant Decoded, where we uncover the hidden psychology behind avoidant behavior, attachment, and emotional connection. If you want deeper insights, practical understanding, and powerful relationship psychology, consider becoming a member of Avoidant Decoded and join us as we decode what others often leave unexplained. There is one night I still remember with surprising clarity. I was sitting on the bathroom floor, not because something terrible had happened, but because the cold tile beneath me somehow helped me feel steady. My phone was in my hand, and I was scrolling through months of messages and conversations. For the first time, I stopped trying to justify everything I was seeing and simply looked at the pattern. I had started every conversation, every one. I was always the person breaking the silence, sending the first message, checking in, following up, offering warmth, and trying to keep the connection alive. Seeing all of those conversations together created a realization I couldn't ignore. It wasn't ordinary sadness. It felt more like grieving the discovery that underneath all my effort was a quiet hope that if I kept showing up long enough, eventually they would turn around and choose to show up for me. I had convinced myself that patience might unlock something in them. Maybe if I loved them carefully enough, communicated gently enough, and remained available without asking for too much, eventually something would change. Maybe one day they would become the person who reached out first, noticed my absence, felt the distance, and wanted to close it. That kind of hope can become incredibly powerful because it makes you believe your next move might finally create the response you've been waiting for. But after experiencing this dynamic personally and hearing similar stories from countless others, I began realizing that we often ask ourselves the wrong question. We ask, what can I say that will make an avoidant person initiate? What can I do to make them miss me? How much space should I give them so they finally come closer? Those questions make sense when someone pulls away. Your mind naturally searches for both an explanation and a solution. You begin believing there must be a perfect combination of words, timing, affection, distance, patience, or silence that will finally produce the reaction you want. But look beneath those questions. You're still trying to manage another person's behavior. You're trying to find the strategy that will make them move toward you. And that can keep you trapped inside the exact cycle that is exhausting you. Instead of asking what you need, you're studying what they need. Instead of examining what the relationship is actually giving you, you're constantly deciding what you should do next. Eventually, the question has to change. It becomes less about how do I make them reach for me and more about why am I continuing to wait for someone who isn't reaching. This is where attachment psychology gives us an important perspective. Certain avoidant attachment patterns are often associated with what researchers call deactivating strategies. These are psychological responses that can reduce awareness of attachment needs, minimize emotional dependence, and create distance when intimacy begins to feel uncomfortable. And the important part is that these reactions aren't necessarily deliberate. When an avoidantly attached person's attachment system becomes activated, closeness itself can begin to feel threatening. In some cases, the more emotionally important the relationship becomes, the stronger the urge to create distance can become. From your perspective, it can feel completely confusing. You're offering affection, patience, understanding, and reassurance, yet they seem to experience increasing closeness as something they need to escape instead of something they can simply enjoy. For some people with strong avoidant tendencies, these patterns can be connected to early experiences where emotional needs weren't consistently welcomed or responded to. A child who repeatedly learns that vulnerability leads to rejection, dismissal, disappointment, or emotional unavailability may eventually stop expressing those needs. The child adapts. They learn to rely heavily on themselves. They minimize their emotions. They stop expecting comfort from others. What once helped them survive an emotionally difficult environment can later become an automatic way of relating. That doesn't mean every avoidant person had the same childhood, and attachment patterns cannot be reduced to one simple explanation. But it can help us understand why intimacy sometimes activates defenses that seem irrational from the outside. And this is where it becomes painful for the person who loves them. You may genuinely be trying to create safety. You may communicate respectfully, offer them space, remain patient, and make every effort to avoid unnecessary pressure. Yet their internal system may not experience all of that warmth as simple safety. A part of them may interpret increasing emotional closeness as pressure, vulnerability, or a threat to independence. That doesn't necessarily mean you're actually pressuring them. Their internal alarm system may simply have learned to associate intimacy with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger. For a long time, I made the mistake of translating someone's withdrawal into a statement about my own worth. I thought their distance meant I wasn't loving them correctly. Eventually, I understood something important. Another person's defense mechanism is not automatically a measurement of the value of your love. But there's another part of this dynamic that matters just as much, and that's what happens over time. There is a progression, and somewhere within that progression, the entire relationship can begin to change. Most people search for the turning point in the avoidant person's behavior. They wait for the message, the realization, the confession, or the moment when the other person suddenly becomes emotionally available. But the deeper turning point often begins somewhere else. It starts when you stop organizing your behavior around producing a particular response from them. The first stage is what I would call the performance stage. This is when you begin shaping yourself around another person's emotional limitations. You become highly observant. You learn their moods, memorize their patterns, notice how long they usually take to respond, and start calculating how much closeness might be too much. You become more accommodating, more careful, more cautious about expressing what you actually need. You may tell yourself you're simply trying to understand them better. You start researching avoidant attachment. You watch videos about emotional regulation. You read about nervous systems, relationship dynamics, trauma responses, and attachment styles. None of that is inherently bad. Understanding psychology can be valuable. The problem begins when knowledge becomes another way to constantly adjust yourself so that the other person never has to experience discomfort. You start analyzing every interaction before it even happens. Should I text first? Should I wait? Was that message too emotional? Did I show too much interest? Should I pull back? Maybe they need more space. Maybe if I stop asking questions, they'll come closer. Maybe I should act less interested. Slowly, the relationship stops being something you simply experience and becomes something you manage. Your attention shifts away from your emotional reality and toward monitoring theirs. You begin treating their comfort as the central requirement for connection. And because you're constantly adapting, you might even believe you're becoming better at relationships. But underneath that patience, something else may be happening. You may be silencing yourself so often that you can no longer tell the difference between understanding someone and abandoning your own needs. That's why the performance stage becomes so exhausting. You're not simply loving someone anymore. You're calculating the safest possible version of yourself for them. You monitor your words, timing, emotional intensity, expectations, and reactions. You become afraid that asking for too much will push them away, while asking for too little leaves you emotionally starving. So you compromise again. You wait longer. You send another gentle message. You explain their silence by reminding yourself of their attachment style. Eventually, understanding why someone behaves the way they do can become easier than admitting what their behavior is doing to you. And that's the trap. You can become so focused on explaining someone else's behavior that you stop asking whether the relationship, exactly as it exists today, is actually meeting your needs. The deepest shift begins when you stop confusing compassion with unlimited accommodation. You can understand why someone withdraws without deciding that you must tolerate endless withdrawal. You can recognize their attachment patterns without becoming responsible for fixing them. You can have compassion for their fear of intimacy while still acknowledging your own need for consistency, reciprocity, affection, communication, and emotional presence. Both realities can be true. Their history may explain their behavior, but an explanation does not automatically make that behavior sustainable for you. And once you begin seeing that clearly, your focus starts changing. Instead of asking, "How can I make an avoidant person choose me?" you begin asking, "What kind of relationship am I actually willing to participate in?" That is where the real turning point begins. Not when you discover the perfect text, not when you master the perfect amount of distance, not when you finally figure out how to make someone afraid of losing you. The shift begins when you stop treating their response as the final judgment of your worth. You stop believing that one more effort will finally prove that you're worthy enough to be chosen. You begin observing instead of chasing. You pay attention to actions instead of building your future around potential. You allow someone's behavior to give you information rather than immediately turning it into a problem you must solve. And strangely, this can change the entire dynamic. Not because you've learned how to control them, but because you've started taking responsibility for the one person whose behavior you can actually influence: yourself. Of course, wanting to become a person whose presence feels emotionally safe is not a bad thing. When you genuinely love someone, it's natural to want to understand what helps them feel secure. Patience and compassion have value. But there is a cycle that can develop between two people without either person intentionally creating it. One person moves toward connection, the other feels a stronger need for space. That withdrawal creates anxiety in the first person, so they pursue harder. The increased pursuit makes the second person want even more distance, and the cycle continues. This is often described as the pursue-withdraw pattern. One person's attempt to gain reassurance can activate the other's instinct to deactivate and retreat. That retreat then increases uncertainty, which causes even more pursuit. Eventually, both people are reacting to each other's coping strategies instead of responding to the relationship itself. And I want to make something very clear. Your love did not create another person's avoidant attachment. You are not responsible for defenses that developed long before they met you. But repeated pursuit can sometimes keep the environment around those defenses activated. Without intending to, you may reinforce what their nervous system already expects: that closeness comes with demands, intimacy brings pressure, and emotional connection means losing control or independence. Then comes the second stage: depletion. This is when all that effort starts taking a real toll on you. At first, you might barely notice it. You're just a little more anxious, a little more tired, a little less emotionally settled. Eventually, though, the exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore. It's not ordinary tiredness that disappears after sleeping. It's the exhaustion that comes from constantly monitoring yourself. You've spent so much time thinking about what they might feel, how they might react, and what might make them disappear, that you've lost contact with your own natural responses. You know their tone, you know their silence, you know their withdrawal patterns. You have become extremely skilled at reading them. But somewhere along the way, you stopped asking yourself what you were feeling. You may realize that you've been filtering your personality for so long that being completely yourself feels unfamiliar. You soften your requests before making them. You lower your expectations before expressing them. You convince yourself that wanting consistency is unreasonable because you know they struggle with intimacy. But here's something important to remember. Someone else's attachment difficulty does not automatically make your emotional needs excessive. Developing a healthier capacity for intimacy generally requires repeated experiences where closeness does not lead to overwhelming demands, punishment, loss of autonomy, or emotional chaos. Safety is learned gradually. Someone may need to learn that they can move toward another person without becoming trapped, that vulnerability doesn't automatically lead to rejection, and that connection doesn't have to destroy independence. But their healing cannot be carried by their partner. You can participate differently. You can approach without chasing. You can give someone space without turning that space into abandonment. You can communicate warmth without constantly demanding reassurance. You can remain emotionally available without making yourself endlessly available. There is a way of loving someone that doesn't require running after them. It feels steady instead of frantic. It is open without being desperate. It allows connection without turning connection into pressure. And here's something people often miss. Two people can perform the exact same action for completely different reasons. You can give someone space because you're trying to make them miss you, or you can give them space because you respect their autonomy while also respecting yourself. You can send a loving message because you genuinely want to express something, or you can send that same message because you're hoping it will finally produce the reaction you've been waiting for. From the outside, those actions may look identical. Internally, they are completely different. Your body often knows when you're acting from fear and when you're acting from groundedness. That's why reclaiming yourself matters so much. The goal isn't to perfect your technique. The goal is to stop living in a state where every decision secretly revolves around producing a particular reaction from another person. There is also a physiological side to this. Long-term stress can influence how people experience emotional closeness, bonding, and connection. When a nervous system has spent years expecting stress or threat, Experiences that are objectively safe may still feel unfamiliar. The body doesn't automatically interpret closeness as safety simply because someone is being kind. The nervous system learns through repetition. If intimacy has historically been associated with pressure, conflict, criticism, rejection, or loss of independence, even genuine affection can sometimes trigger defensive responses. That is one reason you cannot simply become more available and expect another person's internal alarm system to shut down. You cannot force someone to feel safe. What you can control is whether you continue adding pressure through chasing, over-explaining, repeatedly checking in, or trying to secure a particular outcome. Then comes another stage, arrival. But arrival may not look anything like the dramatic transformation you've imagined. It doesn't necessarily begin with a huge confession or a perfectly worded declaration of love. Sometimes it looks surprisingly ordinary. Maybe they send a message that actually has substance instead of a vague check-in. Maybe they finally address something they've avoided. Maybe they apologize without immediately making excuses. Maybe they initiate contact simply because they genuinely want connection, rather than because you've created the perfect circumstances for them to respond. You'll notice the difference because the energy behind it is different. It doesn't feel like another breadcrumb designed to keep the relationship barely alive. It feels like intentional movement toward you, even if vulnerability still makes them uncomfortable. And that's an important distinction. Real movement toward intimacy does not mean fear suddenly disappears. An avoidant person can still feel nervous about closeness and choose to move toward it anyway. They may still need space sometimes. They may still have moments when old defenses return. The difference is that they begin taking responsibility for what happens next. They start initiating, they communicate, they repair, they explain, they participate. The relationship stops depending entirely on you to create every opportunity for connection. Arrival isn't perfection, it's reciprocity. It's the point where you no longer have to manufacture every moment of closeness, because the other person has started creating some of those moments themselves. People can develop healthier attachment patterns. What is sometimes described as earned, secure attachment can emerge through repeated, intentional experiences of safety, consistency, emotional awareness, and healthier relational choices. Someone who has spent years relying on avoidant defenses can gradually learn a different way of relating if they genuinely participate in that process. Over time, they may become more comfortable saying when something is wrong instead of disappearing. They may become more capable of asking questions rather than immediately assuming criticism or rejection. They may learn to communicate what they feel without preparing themselves for humiliation, conflict, or punishment. Change is possible, but one boundary is absolutely essential. Another person cannot create that transformation for them. You can offer patience, you can offer kindness, you can offer understanding, you can create emotional safety, but you cannot make someone choose the inner work required to become more secure. And please don't turn that truth into another reason to blame yourself. If someone with avoidant patterns hasn't been initiating contact, it does not automatically mean you weren't lovable enough. It doesn't mean you said the wrong thing. It doesn't mean you cared too much. It doesn't mean you gave too much space. It doesn't mean you failed to become the perfect partner for their nervous system. You could have been emotionally mature, patient, understanding, and deeply loving, and they could still struggle to move toward you. Some people with avoidant patterns genuinely care about the people they become attached to. Their difficulty isn't always a lack of emotion. Sometimes the struggle is their ability to tolerate, communicate, and express those emotions within a close relationship. That internal conflict belongs to them. Their defenses, fears, habits, and willingness to work through those patterns are part of their personal journey. You can walk beside someone. You cannot walk their path for them. That's why the most meaningful work isn't learning another technique to make them contact you. It's not finding the perfect message. It's not becoming mysterious. It's not calculating the exact amount of silence. It's not discovering how much affection their nervous system can tolerate. The deeper work is building a life that remains meaningful, even if they never become the person you hoped they would become. And that doesn't mean becoming cold or pretending they don't matter. It means genuinely asking yourself what you want from love. What kind of relationship allows you to feel secure? What level of communication do you need? What does consistency mean to you? Is the connection you're receiving actually compatible with those needs? Someone can care about you and still be incapable of giving you the relationship you need. Someone can be kind. They can have beautiful moments with you. They can genuinely feel something for you. And still, what they are capable of offering may not be enough to build a healthy partnership. That can be difficult to accept because we naturally focus on potential. We remember the moments when they were warm, affectionate, vulnerable, or emotionally present. Those moments become proof of what the relationship might eventually become. Then we tolerate everything between those moments because we believe the better version of the person is still somewhere inside them, waiting to emerge. But relationships cannot survive on potential alone. At some point, you have to examine the pattern instead of the isolated moments. Who initiates? Who communicates? Who repairs after conflict? Who makes room for the other's needs? Who continues showing up when things become emotionally uncomfortable? These questions aren't demands for perfection. They're ways of seeing reality clearly. You don't have to demonize someone to admit that what they currently offer isn't enough for you. Compassion and honesty can exist at the same time, and something profound happens when you stop performing for another person's emotional availability. You don't suddenly have to become cold. You don't have to withhold affection. You don't have to pretend you don't care. You simply reach a point where your well-being is no longer something you're willing to sacrifice in exchange for the possibility of receiving a particular reaction from them. You stop asking how to become easier to love. You stop changing every part of yourself to prevent their withdrawal. You stop treating their distance like a problem that requires another effort from you. And when that happens, something changes, whether they change or not. You become less reactive. Your attention returns to your own life. Your decisions become clearer. You can care about someone without constantly monitoring them. Ironically, this may also create the kind of emotional environment where an avoidant person's own feelings have more room to become noticeable, because you're no longer filling every moment of distance with pursuit. But don't turn that into another strategy. Don't hear this and think, if I stop chasing, they'll finally come back. That's simply the old pattern wearing a new disguise. You would still be doing something in order to control their reaction. You would still be waiting for a reward. Real reclamation means you stop making their return the proof that your growth worked. If they reach out, you look at what they're actually offering. If they don't, you keep living. You're no longer standing at the door waiting for them to knock because you finally became distant enough. You're building a life where that door is no longer the center of your existence. That's a completely different emotional position. You're not trying to manipulate their attachment system anymore. You're allowing reality to show you what they are capable of, while making sure you don't disappear from your own life. You already know that you cannot chase someone into genuinely choosing you. But there's another truth that's just as important. You cannot weight yourself into being chosen either. Waiting can appear peaceful on the outside, while anxiety is raging underneath. You may tell yourself you're simply being patient, but if every day revolves around whether they text, whether they miss you, whether they finally recognize your value, then you're still holding your breath. Your emotional life is still on pause. You're still searching for evidence that your effort mattered. And that's why I keep returning to that image of the bathroom floor. It's the picture of someone going backward through every conversation, desperately searching for proof that they were enough. Trying to locate the exact moment when they could have behaved differently. Trying to transform another person's inability to reciprocate into a judgment about their own worth. But your love was not the problem. Your ability to care was never something you needed to apologize for. You did not become less worthy because someone struggled to receive closeness. You did not become unlovable because another person's defenses were stronger than their ability to connect. And you do not have to spend the rest of your life proving that your love was genuine. It already was. The question in front of you now is quieter, but far more important. Are you willing to take some of the love you've spent directing outward and begin giving some of it back to yourself? Not as revenge, not because they suddenly don't matter, not because you've stopped caring, but because you matter too. Your emotional energy is valuable. Your future deserves your attention. And love becomes something entirely different when you no longer have to abandon yourself just to keep offering it to someone else.